My grandmother, Lela Ripley Murtagh, was a tough and resourceful woman, but she was also a loving wife and mother. She unfortunately died young, well before I was born. She lived through 2 world wars, economic depressions, and pandemics. She was part of the greatest generation. My generation cannot conceive what those hardships would have been like. This video provides some of the highlights of her life so my family can learn more about this woman who is an important part of our family history. Lela Ripley Murtagh was born to Ada and Tweety Ripley in 1909 in a small town in Nova Scotia called Chinecto. Her family had been in Canada for 150 years after immigrating from Yorkshire, England. She spoke little about her parents or her life in Nova Scotia. My father recalls her saying, too sad, and everyone died when asked about her youth. My father recalls that when he was growing up in Framingham, Massachusetts, they did not have a wreath on their door at Christmas because that was what the people did in Nova Scotia when someone died. A wreath reminded his mother of all the people dying when she was young. During that time, World War I, the Spanish flu, scarlet fever, smallpox, and diphtheria epidemics killed many Nova Scotians and nearly wiped out some of the families. Lela's family lived in Chinecto, Nova Scotia. Chinecto was built around coal, but by the early 1900s, the town was small and no longer prosperous. The big coal mining operations had closed down by the time Lela was born, but Thomas Edison was leading the effort to build a big power plant over the coal seams. Coal work was dangerous, and many people died doing it. Coal work was not the only danger. During World War I, a large military munitions ship, the Mont Blanc, exploded in the Halifax harbor in Nova Scotia. The explosion destroyed much of Halifax and killed more than 1,800 people. Known as the Great Halifax Explosion, it was felt in Chinecto, almost 100 miles away. Even though Lela's family was not well off, they sent baby clothes and other provisions to help. Lela went to what was most likely a 1-room schoolhouse. We do not know if she excelled in school or even if she liked going to school. The class photos show that some of her siblings were also her classmates. Like most of the town's population, Lela's father Tweety worked hard but had little to show for it. But the family was content. They had food, shelter, and one another. That was enough. In 1917, when Lela was only 8, disaster struck when her father died of pneumonia at age 43, leaving the family without a wage earner. When she was young, Lela's leg was crushed at a Sunday school picnic when a swing broke. My Aunt Tootie recalls hearing how Ada took her to a young doctor who, after setting the leg, insisted that unless she had a physical exercise program, she would not walk again. Being insightful, Ada arranged for Lela to learn to play the pump organ. My father recalls hearing his mother talking about the snow in Nova Scotia being so deep in the winter that they would tunnel from the house to the barn to feed the horses. Their house was situated over a coal field. Like many other families, they bootlegged coal that was under their homes. There was an opening in the Ripley's basement floor where they mined coal for heat. Ada remarried, but she too died young in 1924 after a long illness where she became swollen and wheelchair-bound and eventually confined to bed. After Lela's mother died, the family was split up. The two youngest children, whose father was Ada's second husband, were sent to England to live with his relatives and were never seen again, and he left Nova Scotia. The oldest sister, Viola, stayed in the old farmhouse where she lived for many years. The other children were scattered to different families. Lela and her siblings were essentially orphaned. Lela was sent to a family that ran a railroad station where she learned to be a telegraph operator and would flag down trains when they were needed. My father recalls that as a Boy Scout, he had to learn the Morse code. He was very surprised that his mother knew it perfectly. I could find no photos of Lela from that time period. These are photos of typical Nova Scotia railroad homes. Perhaps she lived in one similar to these. In 1927, on July 4th, Lela, 17 years old, and two of her sisters, Ruby and Flora, left Nova Scotia and moved to Framingham, Massachusetts to be with their older sister Ella. One reason Leah may have been eager to leave Nova Scotia was that the family that ran the railroad station had arranged a potential marriage for her. The well-meaning family found an older railroad worker, an engineer, whom they thought would make a suitable husband for her. We do not know what he looked like, but these historic photos show some of the typical railroad engineers. Apparently, Lela was not interested, so that may have been a big reason for wanting to make the big move to Framingham, Massachusetts. In Framingham, Lela's sister Ella arranged for Lela to meet Dr. James Glass. She went to work for Dr. Glass as a receptionist, but over time became in a way part of the family. She lived with the Glass family, and at one point Dr. Glass wanted to adopt Lela, but for some reason Mrs. Glass opposed it. For Lela, they became like a second family during the early years. The relationship was complex, but gave her some financial and social stability and allowed her to enjoy life. Over the years, Lela stayed close to the family. My father recalls that they would often visit Mrs. Glass long after Dr. Glass passed away. There is a story about one such visit that almost ended tragically for our family. In 1938, when my father was 2 years old, a huge hurricane hit while they were on one of those visits. There were no early warning systems back then to alert the people about storms. My father was in a crib on the porch when the storm struck. He was brought into the house, and a few minutes later, a large tree was blown over and crushed the porch where my father had been in the crib. Not long before Lela arrived in the U.S., John J. Murtagh, a young man, moved to Framingham, Massachusetts. Soon after he moved to Framingham, he became acquainted with Lela's sister Ella. Ella told John that she was getting ready to go to Canada and that she was going to bring back the perfect girlfriend for him. One Saturday evening, Ella came into the A&P store where John worked, and there was a young girl with her. She mentioned that the people in the community from Nova Scotia were going to have a square dance and would like him to go. The handsome, athletic young man was more acceptable to Lela than the older engineer had been. John's parents also liked Lela. John's father, Edward Murtagh, had also been orphaned when he was a young child, and he and Lela became especially close over the years. The Depression years from 1929 to 1938 were very hard and must have made planning for the future difficult. In 1935, the Depression appeared to be fading. things were looking up. John and Lela got married. Mrs. Glass, still an important part of Lela's life, insisted that she would not recognize the marriage unless John changed his name to Ripley. Of course, John did not, but Mrs. Glass remained an important part of Lela's life. It was not long before John and Lela had their first child, my father, also named John. The economic recovery of 1935, however, did not last. The economy contracted again, and the future looked grim again. Despite the economic situation, my father remembers his mother being content with her family life. During the first years of marriage, John and Lela moved from town to town. Eventually, the Murtaghs moved to Morse Road in Framingham. Mr. Dunlop owned a group of foreclosed houses on Morse Road. John Murtagh was hired to renovate the houses for resale. In payment, he was given one of the houses. That house, 49 Morse Road, would remain in the family for many years. Despite being separated after Ada's death, the siblings tried to stay close. Her sister Bertha, however, died of tuberculosis when she was 18. David and Ella moved back to Nova Scotia. This photo shows Flora, Ruby, and Lela back together again as adults. The three of them lived near one another and did well. Lela and Flora were especially close. My father remembers that the two of them would get a kick out of dressing him up in Flora's older daughter's dresses when he was little. Lela had a support network with her sisters in a happy marriage. Life was good. A few years later, the U.S. entered World War II. That meant upheaval for the family, as it did for many others. John was drafted in the U.S. Army and left for Europe. Lela was left to raise their three children all alone. Though the Great Depression was long over, money was still very tight for the family. Lela was only getting $48 a month assistance while her husband was in the Army. To make ends meet, she did some babysitting at the house. My Aunt Tootie speculates that her grandfather, Edward H. Murtagh, who worked at an A&P grocery store, provided some extra groceries. Edward and his wife Catherine were not well off, so they could only provide limited help. My Aunt Tootie also recalls picking blueberries in the nearby fields for pies. Despite all this, my father remembers the family being happy and content. The household was still living in Great Depression conditions. Lela had no car and had to depend on others for transportation. The stove did not work, so Lela used a tin box on top of the stove to cook. When John returned home from Europe wounded, he was sent to the Fort Devens Hospital for medical treatment and convalescence. He did not stay in the hospital as long as the doctors wanted him to, since he said he needed to earn money for his family. He came home with shrapnel in his body. On the first day of the Battle of the Bulge, a soldier near him had stepped on a mine called a Bouncing Betty. John was on the ground or crouching, so he did not get the full blast, but he was still wounded. Shrapnel was still coming out of his body during his last days. The house on Morse Road had only 2 bedrooms. Around 1951, an addition was built in the back of the house, and the attic was finished off for the boys to use as their bedroom. To get to the attic, the boys had to go through their sister's bedroom. The house was heated with coal. There was a coal chute in front of the house. It was dusty when the coal was delivered. The windows were leaky. It was hard to stay warm in the cold Massachusetts winters. The house did not have central heat and was not well insulated. To stay warm, they had to wear heavy clothes inside. Clothing, however, was hard to come by for the young family. Often the clothes were recycled. When my father's coat was handed down to his sister, it got a crocheted trim. Once it was passed down to Richard, that was removed. I can remember we had a large oval rug in our house that Lela made. The rug was made from strips of old worn clothing braided and sewed together. Making the large braided rugs provided Lela with satisfaction. For Lela, making the rugs was a social activity since friends and family helped each other out. Lela loved antiques. There was a running family joke that when they drove somewhere, if John sped up the car, it meant there was an antique store coming up. Lela would say if she spotted in time, "Oh, stop! Let's go inside!" In addition to antiques, my father remembers buckets of water with canes in them. The canes would be softened and used for recaning chairs. Their daughters Susan and Kathy were born after the war. Tragically, Lela was diagnosed with colon cancer during her pregnancy in 1951 and underwent treatment for 3 years. She lived life the best she could and said goodbye to her family, in part through heartfelt letters. She died in 1954. This is the letter she wrote to her husband John, read by her granddaughter Kristen Westerberg Higgins.
1954. Hello, sweetheart. Of all the letters I have written you, this will be the hardest to say what I feel. You have been a wonderful husband and father, and if I ever got cross or found fault sometimes, it was only because I expected you to be perfect, maybe. That none of us are. I'm sorry if there's anything I shouldn't have said or done. I don't want you to have any regrets about anything. You know how sometimes we go back over the past and we think we should have done this or we shouldn't have done that? None of that. We each did the best we could as we went along. You were wonderful, and knowing you will take good care of the children is the only thing that helps right now when everything seems so wrong. I know you will do everything you can to see that they are well taken care of, and that helps so much. My heart aches. So if I look ahead at all, that's only 1 hour at a time is all I will allow myself to think. I try to leave everything in God's hands and be resigned. It isn't easy when I look at the little faces, so innocent and sweet, full of love and confidence, and then their mother leaves them. Try to have things go along as nearly as normal as you can. In that way, they will be less upset. At times, I just can't help hoping for a miracle, if only until the little ones are a little older. I love you, John, and you have been a wonderful husband, and I hope you will be happy again someday. Only just be sure it is someone who will be good to the little ones. I'm so heartbroken right now that all I can think of is the welfare and happiness of the children and you, and especially the little ones. Until we are about to lose it, we don't realize how sweet life is, how much everyone means to us, and how good it is just to be alive and able to take care of your family, because we are told everything is for the best, even if it doesn't seem so at the time. I'm rambling here, but I hope you will understand what I mean and how I mean it. Think of me sometimes, dear, and say a prayer for me, and above all, have patience with our children. It won't be long before they are grown and on their own with only memories of us. Let's hope they are all pleasant ones. Well, dear, I must close. So long, and God bless you always and keep you well and strong for the job ahead and give you all the graces you will need. All my love, your sweetheart and wife, Lela.
Lela lived through a lot in those short years. We can only hope we have a bit of that fortitude, determination, and dedication to family that our ancestor had.